My perspective on local first is that I think ideally every developer would love to be able to interact with their APIs as if they were local first. And I say that not necessarily meaning like offline, but just I synchronously did this thing and I can trust that it's going to be persisted where it needs to be persisted and then move on and just kind of feel like everything is instantaneous. So I have no doubts that that is what everybody wants. It can be difficult to get there. And if you try and get there too quickly, I don't know, you can get into some trouble. And there's really smart people who are slowly trying to carve out this space and make that a reality.
Welcome to the Local First FM podcast. I'm your host, Johannes Schickling, and I'm a web developer, a startup founder, and love the craft of software engineering. For the past few years, I've been on a journey to build a modern, high-quality music app using web technologies. And in doing so, I've been falling down the rabbit hole of local first software. This podcast is your invitation to join me on that journey. In this episode, I'm speaking to Tanner Linsley, creator of the TanStack ecosystem, including projects such as React Query and TanStack Router. In this episode, we talk about the newest project, TanStack DB, and explore the problems it's trying to solve and how it works. Before getting started, also a big thank you to Jazz for supporting this podcast. And now my interview with Tanner. Hey Tanner, it's so awesome to have you on the podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
I'm very excited to have you. So most of the audience, I'm certain, are familiar with your work, are probably using a lot of your tools, but would you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. My name's Tanner Linsley, and I've been building open source software for, almost 10 years. I've been involved in some startups, one of them for about a decade, where we were building a SaaS product for SEO marketing analytics, which was pretty intense, a lot of fun. And yeah, now I mostly work full-time on TanStack, which is kind of the umbrella of all the tools that I've built or have helped build in the last 8 to 10 years. So yeah, that's what I do.
That is awesome. I think it's safe to say that everyone who's listening has at the very least used a product that is using one of your tools, but I'm also pretty certain that almost everyone is also directly using one of your tools and libraries in some package-JSON dependencies, me included. I'm a huge fan of your work, and you and I actually had the chance to catch up in person again at last year's Next.js Conf in very sunny San Francisco. And this is where I got the chance to show you what I've been working on over the last few years with LiveStore and generally chat about local first. And I think this was probably not your first touch point with local first as such. I think that goes way back further, but maybe you can share a little bit of like your relationship to local first. As I understand it, you are not yet fully in the center. You're aware of it, but you also are developing your own perspective on it. So maybe you want to share that.
When we met at NextConf, and what you showed me was impressive. It was crazy. And the stuff you had been showing me before and after that is just mind-boggling. I think the furthest back I can go for like a local first, or at least what's aspiring to be local first experience, was like back with Meteor and PouchDB. I remember playing with those extensively, just thinking like, wow, this is so cool. And back then it was like, there was a big push to have everything be offline, first, and then sync when it can. Obviously the syntax and the tools, the tooling and everything around local first has like evolved drastically since then. It doesn't even look the same. But that was kind of my first experience with the feeling of local first that you get, where you kind of you can interact with your data pretty much as if it's synchronous and then just kind of forget about it. And that, I think PouchDB was probably the first one that I felt that with. And I was like, wow, this is really magical. It's definitely far from perfect. And there's a reason that, not everybody's using PouchDB anymore, or even were using PouchDB. Yeah, I think in the more modern tool chains, everything you've been working on has been kind of the most eye-opening, along with some of the other stuff from like Convex. Convex is a TanStack partner, and they are kind of like that server first, local first experience as well. And they have really direct ties with TanStack Query, which is why I've experienced a lot of that. So, yeah, my perspective on local first is that I think ideally every developer would love to be able to interact with their APIs as if they were local first. And I say that not necessarily meaning like offline, but just in a very synchronous, I synchronously did this thing and I can trust that it's going to be persisted where it needs to be persisted and then move on and just kind of feel like everything is instantaneous. So I have no doubts that that is what everybody wants. But obviously, as I'm sure we're going to discuss here over the next few minutes, is that it can be difficult to get there. And if you try and get there too quickly, I don't know, you can get into some trouble. And there's really smart people like you and many others who are slowly trying to carve out this space and make that a reality. So I am very anxiously and excitedly watching and also we're trying to take part in that journey where it makes sense for TanStack to take part.
That is awesome. Well, first of all, thank you so much for the kind words. I'm a huge fan of just like overall the way also how you approach your projects, that you get to work on those projects in a sustainable way. And I think this is really why so many people trust your projects. So just wanted to mention that. And there's like many different ways how to reach and go after that goal that you've motivated, that you get instantaneous data, you get the simplicity coming from synchronous data. And I've certainly taken probably a more radical approach on that over the last couple of years, where really like I had the luxury of working on a greenfield project. So I was not burdened with everything that was there before. So I could make much more radical and free design decisions. So in the case of LiveStore, this is why I've embraced event sourcing. But I think you're a bit more on the other side of the spectrum with a technology like React Query, which acknowledges the reality that in most projects, there is already an API, a data source somewhere. And that makes it so much easier to adopt. And that shows in the download numbers and usage of TanStack Query, formerly React Query. And I think this is what most people really find themselves using on a daily basis. But as they aspire to make their app faster, to load more quickly, reload more quickly, then they also try to maybe even make their app work in an offline scenario. Then they try to get there step by step. So maybe you can share some anecdotes of people doing that with TanStack Query, where they reach for optimistic mutations, etc.
Yeah, that happens all the time. I think that's one of the reasons why it took off, is because it's very pragmatic for the slop that most people are working with every day, whether that's your own slop. Hopefully you've been in your job long enough to have to deal with your own slop, or it's slop from before, or you're just moving so fast that that's just what it is. But the reality is that, you know, things are just messy when you're shipping real products to real people as fast as possible. And I built React Query because I needed a way to make the experience better for developers and users without needing to get in the middle of the entire process, like Meteor was trying to do, or like GraphQL was trying to do with, or Apollo. You know, I needed as little buy-in as possible with the maximum amount of effect, and that's what it came to be. And I think it's very natural when you start playing with Query, you start to realize that it is, in a way, a sync engine, right? You have defined these declarative subscriptions to your data. It's very manual, right? Very coarse-grained manual timings of like, how often do I want to go and get this thing, right? So it's in the middle of like a one-off API call and a sync engine, but it is living and breathing. And the life cycle of that life in this query cycle still takes some effort from users, you know. So when you change something, you need to let query know that you've changed something at the very least. And we call that just invalidation, right? And this is kind of like the bare minimum for what I would call probably the worst sync engine you could want, is just like, I've changed something, invalidate everything, and just resync everything, right? It's very manual. You are the one deciding when to resync. And it turns out that a lot of developers just weren't doing that in the first place. So it's crazy to think that just giving people a good tool like Query and then telling them, hey, when you change something, you need to just mark everything as dirty and resync it. Just that has improved everybody's apps a ton, and user apps. It's like, oh, data is up to date. It's not super efficient, it's not automatic or whatever, but it is. So I think that's the bare minimum, and that's the reality where a lot of developers are today. Is they're probably still coming. I mean, they may even be coming from .NET or some monolithic backend shop into front end, and they've never done any front end syncing, data syncing at all. And they might just think, well, I'm just going to call my API and display the data, right? So I think that's the reality for most developers. Most successful companies are not running the latest and greatest. And many of them probably don't even know, the first thing about designing a sync engine. I barely know anything about them. So I wouldn't expect many of your run-of-the-mill developers to know a lot about it either. So, but I think that's the first step. And I think personally that once you taste that, it's addicting and you want more of that. And you naturally start to say, okay, how can I make this faster, right? And that's on the reads end, which is kind of like the bare minimum. It's like, oh, I want to read my data and make sure that's up to date. And then you start thinking about the writes and you're like, oh, well, what would be cool is if when I click this button, it just showed that it's done. Even though we know it takes, a hot second for it to go and be done and then to resync all the data, it'd be cool if it was just looked like it was done. And so we call that optimistic update, right? Like optimistic data manipulation. And Query has that built in. Again, it's very manual. You have to manipulate the cache that's in your browser in the Query client to represent that new state manually. And you fire off the mutation or the change that's going to result in that state. And then you just kind of cross your fingers that when you invalidate your data when it's done and that new data comes in, it matches what you optimistically put in there. Again, this is like, from my perspective, if you can implement optimistic mutations with something like Query, you're already so much further ahead than what the standard has been for a very, very, very long time. But like I said, it's very addicting. So then after that, you start to think, okay, this mutation thing that I'm doing, these optimistic updates, those are tedious. It's like, well, I have to make those make those optimizations myself and manipulate the cache, and it feels dirty, right? And so that's when it starts to get a little more intense with like, okay, how could we make it so that when I say I clicked this button and I should like this post somewhere, that I don't have to go in and manually kind of do the optimistic update, that my mutation can just know what it's going to affect, make the update, send it to wherever it needs to go, and then it will sync when it needs to. And then we can just carry on, not just as like a user interface to click something and be able to carry on immediately, but also as a developer to be able to say, this is what's changing, and then just move on, not have to worry about optimistic updates and cache invalidations and whatnot. So this is where I think, at least for me, where things start to get really, really fun and really, really scary, mostly because it's a new space, right? And, to give you my perspective on it, I haven't gone too far down that rabbit hole, to be honest, because it involves a lot of knowledge about a system. It usually involves knowing about schema or creating schema in some way. There's different implications for where that data is being synced, whether it's like offline or on a server or through WebSockets or REST or whatever. So there's just a lot that comes with that. And that has been intimidating for me because it's difficult for me to generalize, where like React Query was easy to generalize. But it doesn't mean that we're not thinking about it,
This was a perfect tour from the beginnings of the motivations that led to React Query and now TanStack Query. the benefit it provides and like how far it gets you, but also like to the point where it brings you, where things are already working pretty well, but maybe you face some new challenges and you would like things to work even more automatically in the right way, but you now need to better understand that. And this is also like nicely reflects like a lot of my thinking over the last decade, where I've been wrestling with the same ideas and the same challenges. And a few points always like bubbled up to me again as like, this can't be ignored in a generalized way. And I think this is really the key point to underscore here, like looking for a generalized solution. And like, at least I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but I don't think for data there is a generalizable solution, because data is like the ultimate as it depends. And I think this is where a technology like React, as like the first of its kind in a way, showed us a like close to generalizable solution that applied so perfectly to so many different situations and use cases. And unfortunately, I don't think that is realistic for data, just because for data, you have just different trade-offs. Let's say you're building a banking app. This is where you really want to be certain, has that wire gone out or not? But if you're building, let's say, a note-taking app, it is actually more important that you can just carry on writing down your thoughts than that you perfectly know that it's also already arrived on the server. And so it's just different trade-offs, and those different trade-offs need or could be productized and systematized into something. And this again is where I think React Query has been just so phenomenal in striking those trade-offs, meet people where most of them are, where they don't need the perfect thing. Something good is already better than nothing, and then just like calling fetch themselves and then dealing with that somehow. But for people who want to now go further for a more specialized path, I think this is where now there's like a tree of potential new approaches and potential new technologies, and some of them you've been investigating. And I think one particular like hairy topic here to investigate further is like, how do you get for the writes that you're doing, for the optimistic updates or the updates more generally, what happens when you're updating data? Like most directly, you're updating data in like a local variable somehow running in your, let's say, React app. But then you're also maybe posting to an API endpoint. And now it's already, the universes are already potentially splitting. So you've updated your variable, maybe your API request goes through, and as that API request is being propagated further, fails somewhere there, and now you need to unwind the entire thing. But let's say maybe you do 2 API requests, one goes through, the other doesn't go through. Now you're like in the split brain situation. And so now you need to, should you wind it back? Should you partially wind it back? And now you need to handle that on your API server as well as on your client. And on the client, maybe you just say like, you know what, if we hit this case, it's so rare, we just show an error message and say to user like reload. But maybe it's not so rare, and then you need to think about it in a more principled way. And this is where another kind of manifestation of that is cache inconsistency. And there is a really great blog post that goes along the lines of like, your app shouldn't become a database. We'll link it in the description. But I think that is like a very nice and provocative post that shows the reality of most ambitious apps, that as you pull more in that thread, your app becomes a database with all the hard things about a database. And it needs to be transactionally consistent. So if you click that button, maybe it should reflect in state over here and over there. And if it doesn't, your app feels broken, or things might actually, like, you get the dreaded undefined is not a function because like some like array index is not there, etc. And the more you pull on that, the more you want kind of like a React-like foundation that you can just trust, that is maybe a bit more specialized to your use case, but you can actually trust and it just works. And this is where I hope things are going, like basically a tree of different possibilities for mature and well-designed data systems that match the corresponding set of trade-offs. And it's now our role as educators to educate developers which trade-offs work well for their apps and what are good solutions and systems for those. And I think that something like React Query has been an excellent catch-all that already lifts people up. So I'm curious whether that makes sense to you.
Yeah, I think that makes total sense. And, the way that I have always looked at like trying to solve these kinds of problems is I'm always looking for like the least common denominator, right? And you can never find something that's perfect, but you can find something that's 90%. And then once you have tackled that problem, you can kind of move down the spectrum to the use cases that might be more important or more intense, but, are not the least common denominator. And I think that's where React Query sits for me. It's not the tool for all of the really, really specific, difficult use cases, but 90% of the time it's the right choice. And then we can also, if you can build something where you can build on top of it to get to those other use cases, then that's even better. In this scenario, I personally am opening up more to the idea where there could be this general like solution, right? I don't know exactly how that looks. Like you said, I mean, React kind of just happened and it was like, oh, wow, this is a great solution for the problem. Components. I don't know if I've seen the component solution for like data yet, because there's so many different trade-offs, like you said. I'm so interested in synchronous data management through things like signals. Like I talk with Ryan Carniato all the time about he's working on all this new signals stuff, and I just love it. And I'm like, wow, this in terms of like reactivity, this is amazing. This is something to keep your eye on. But a lot of the signal stuff that we see also isn't crossing the network gap all the time. And so that gets weird into like, well, how do you then roll things back, or how do you do transactions? And so there's this split world, like you said, between lots of effort going into both of these. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. So I'll fill you in a little bit on something that we have been working on. A little while ago, we teased a library called TanStack Optimistic. And the idea around TanStack Optimistic came from Kyle Matthews, and he's actually the one who's been spearheading it, and which is a crazy full circle, because if you go back 6 or 7 years, Kyle and I were actually competing at one point building static site generation software. I was building React Static, and he was working on Gatsby, and Next.js was getting into static site gen. And it was cool. He went and raised money and turned Gatsby into this awesome thing. And I was like, well, I have a company already, so I'm going to fold. I said, I'll have to do this later. And what do you know? Now he's working on at a company doing Electric SQL and really cool stuff there. And now I'm the one building the framework. So the roles feel reversed, but we're working together on some things right now because Kyle at Electric SQL, they had become very interested in this exact kind of general toolkit that we have kind of been alluding to. And one of the first problems that they ran into with Electric SQL and React Query and all this was that they needed those optimistic updates to work, but in a way that was kind of compatible with not just Electric SQL, but just kind of in general. Like, what's this general kind of optimistic transactional layer? And that's what TanStack Optimistic started out as. And I mean, it worked. It was functional. It still works today, right now, but it's already evolving. So that was just, a couple months ago that we were talking about TanStack Optimistic. So problem number one, TanStack Optimistic is a bad name because we already have optimistic updates in React Query, TanStack Query. So it's like, well, does this have something to do with Query? So it was confusing. The second problem was that we wanted to figure out, does this overlap with Query or not? And should it utilize Query, or is it something completely different, right? And so it turns out that part of this layer, we believe up to this point, is that, like you said, if you start pulling on this thread long enough, it becomes a database, right? And I don't really think that's a bad thing, because a database is a very loose term. If you look at React Query, there's a query cache inside of Query, and that's a database. It's a key value store. It's not relational. It's not, sophisticated in any way.
I should clarify, like the application should not become a database. Typically, it accidentally becomes a database, and that's the point. The app shouldn't be the database, but an underlying technology that you use that goes above and beyond to be a database, to do all the hard work that it takes to be a database, that should be the database. And I think that's exactly what you're saying.
Totally agree. Yes. And I think that's the most interesting thing, is that the database is going to be there no matter what, whether it's a replication, a cache, a lens, whatever you want to call it, all these different terms, right? But that's the direction we're headed. So we've actually renamed TanStack Optimistic to TanStack DB. And we're only working on a small part of it right now, which is the optimistic parts and the collections part. So let me get into that a little bit. We don't need to go too far into this, because I'll be honest, Kyle knows 100% more about this than I do. I know 1%. We're just kind of consulting together just to make sure that we can build on top of each other's things. What I understand at this point is that, optimistic updates with something like Query only get you so far. And at some point you need that schema. Like I was saying, you need some kind of structure, and you need some way to declaratively kind of build up these relationships between your data, all of your data, and that you're pulling from somewhere, and your mutations and the actions you're taking against your data. And just having consistent actions against your data solves a lot of the problems around, well, if it was just signals and we're just kind of firing reactivity events off all over the place, how do you transaction those things together? How do you roll things back? I mean, there's ways to do that, but we found that if we formalize things into mutations still, which is very common across a lot of different database implementations, that you transact on those much easier and roll things back. I mean, it's the same way with convex, in LiveStore too. So we want a layer that is purely for the front end. It's purely for the client, where we can define these collections and define these mutations that are going to happen and the relationships between those. And then those can be fulfilled by a sync engine. So for instance, you can make a collection to say, here's all my users, here's my filters on those users, here's pagination, or here's just all the things that kind of create the lens into this data source that I have. And it's formalized contract, formalized schema on how you get that. And then you have mutations that say, I'm mutating this thing, and this thing is a formalized structure within my application, and it has schema. And then behind that layer, you have an adapter to say, okay, now that we have this formalized structure, we can wire this up to whatever we want. We could read using a REST API, and we could say, well, we want to poll it, or we want to use invalidation, or we want to use SSE or something like that. Or you could set it up to work with WebSockets, or you could set it up to work with SQLite or whatever. It just needs to be fulfilled. So in a similar way to React Query, saying a promise is all you need, right? For TanStack DB, the loose vision right now is that you need something that can satisfy the interface, or not even the interface, but the life cycle of a sync engine. And that might be super drop-in, like Electric SQL or whatever. Or it might be more manual, which is what I'm really excited about, to say, I already have a REST API. I'm already using React Query. We can't upgrade into WebSockets or do a bunch of crazy infrastructure stuff right now on the back end. But if we could kind of upgrade the life cycle into this contract of sync engine, right? What does it mean to be a sync engine for the front end? Then you could technically upgrade your front end data reading and writing experience to what feels like a sync engine, but behind the scenes, it could just be going out and kind of using the same APIs that existed in your company a year ago or whatever. So I think that's the vision. And to me, that sounds like a least common denominator approach to it, to say, data could get here somehow, and we're going to send data out somehow, and we're going to build formalized contracts around that. And then hopefully we see adoption around adapters and patterns and utilities, and possibly even around things like TanStack Query, where maybe you don't have WebSockets or server-sent events or sync engine happening. So maybe TanStack Query is the fulfiller of this contract. I think that starts to look very interesting. To be very blunt, that's kind of the envelope. That's the bleeding edge of my opinions and my knowledge on the topic. Everything, honestly, from here forward is probably going to be more nuanced opinion.
That is awesome. And I think that really nicely closed the loop. Something that stuck with me that you said at the beginning of our conversation is that if you squint, React Query is already kind of like a mini sync engine. This is the benefit is it works with everything. The downside is it only goes so far and doesn't handle all of those edge cases in the most resilient way. But with like Pareto principle style, like you do 20% of the effort, you get 80% of the outcome. And now you're connecting this to a variation of it where what React Query already does is like it's the query part. So what do you query? You query from like something where data comes from. And now you basically say, actually, that is already very useful. But where we're getting the data from, there's sort of like this in-between stage where typically you resolve a query to a database. And so we only have that. We don't really acknowledge that there is a database in the middle, but yet there is a database in the middle. And once we have that, and once we acknowledge it and build all the things around it, we can actually query much more, much better, much faster, much safer. We get like super fast filtering. These updates, optimistic updates become simpler, etc. So it's sort of like embracing that.
Schema, when you sprinkle schema into things, a lot of dev tools get better. So the dev tools for query are awesome. Don't get me wrong. I think they're great. But when you have schema and formalized interfaces on top of your data, dev tooling can get way more sophisticated. In fact, I'm remembering all of the awesome stuff that I've seen from LiveStore, out of dev tooling. That's like, it would be impossible to do with a tool with just query, right? But you see some of that come into play when, GraphQL gets involved. It's like, well, now we have schema and now we can do all this cool stuff. It's kind of the same thing here. Whenever you add schema into something and create stricter contracts, even if those contracts are with yourself, like you can build much better tooling around it.
I couldn't agree more. Schemas, like 9 out of 10 cases, it's a great deal. You put in a little bit of work and you get so much out of it constantly in all of those different dimensions, types, validation, and like you can also and I think as an industry, we've only scratched the surface what we can actually do with schemas. Like at least as a JavaScript industry, in other programming languages, schemas are like highly leveraged to, for example, work with data in a more efficient way. So this is where like protobuf, gRPC, etc. A lot of that is used to minimize the amount of data that we send across the wires or have more stable contracts as we're evolving things. And I think we're just scratching the surface of like what will be the JavaScript equivalent where we have SOD right now. Maybe we have something that also gives us the benefit of something like protobuf in, let's say, 2030. Don't want to be overly optimistic here.
Sounds accurate.
But yeah, I think this is super compelling what you're pitching here. And like, I don't think this is just a pitch, but it's actually happening. And Kyle, who we also had previously on the guest, who's now at Electric, is an excellent person to lead the charge on this. So I'm really excited to see that evolve. I have many more questions that I would like to ask you or Kyle, but I won't go too much into that there, just as you mentioned that you're only so far in the weeds so far. But one thing that I'm also curious about in regards to TanStack DB is, do you already have a hunch of like, what is that contract that makes when you bring a pluggable sync engine that you provide there as a data source? What does that need to quack like that it's a duck?
Right. Yes, we do have a flexible and changing idea of what those contracts look like. In fact, inside of it's still at slash or it's still at TanStack slash optimistic on GitHub, but we do already have like some of the core hooks and logic set up in there already to around collections. The documentation obviously isn't there yet, but if you dig into the code and in the examples, you can start to see kind of the silhouette of what syncing is. So, we have some configuration. There's like a sync option that takes a sync configuration. So it has been formalized for now in terms of what we believe it needs to be, to get a proof of concept out the door. And, one of the good examples to go look at in there is there's an electric sync configuration that now dog foods that interface and that contract to kind of give you an idea of how that could feel. Now things are going to change, things are going to get better, upgrade. We'll try and add more adapters and break our expectations. So the idea is that those sync contracts are going to evolve drastically over the next little while.
That sounds awesome. And I'm particularly excited about all of those adapters, since once you start adjusting your own perspective, then almost anything can be a data source or a sync engine for that matter. It might not be inherently reactive, but then you throw polling on it, and until that data source is itself reactive, you can sort of paper over that through polling. And just like let's say the GitHub API could be actually a sync engine implementation. Absolutely. And now you can build a local app that works with like GitHub data just as it's local, like code like it's local.
That's the idea. And going beyond that, I think with query right now, it's easy to get trapped into thinking like, oh, I can just query my one database, or you start thinking, well, I can query multiple, or even start querying anything that is a promise. So once you start thinking about these sync protocol or the sync contract as just something to be fulfilled, it kind of opens up the same gate. It's like a parable to when people are like, oh, I can use React Query to use like device APIs because they're just based on a promise, So I imagine the same thing will happen for these sync contracts. Is we'll kind of just learn that, anything that I can read and write to, I can turn into a sync configuration. And I think it gets really exciting when you start looking at the ability to have multiple sync configurations working together, potentially merging into the same schema in your application. And they might handle different responsibilities. Because the reality is that, a lot of people would love offline. You can do offline for a lot of things, but I don't know of any application that's providing a lot of value these days that doesn't eventually need to connect to the server. And like you said, eventually need very strict transactions on. I did this thing and did it happen? And we cannot proceed until it did, right? So we're trying to make sure that we don't code ourselves into a corner here. And we want to design it so that you can do all of those things, kind of, synchronous first. You can have sync contracts that are very optimistic and just fire and forget, and we'll sync it later. And when you need to, you can kind of go deeper and say, okay, I'm firing off this mutation, but I'd like to opt into some more strict confirmations around it to make sure that we don't proceed. You can lock things easier. So I don't know. I like this future where it's kind of like query for query in a way, where, we're just adding organization. We're adding more intelligent lifecycle. We're adding a heartbeat to what people experience today as React Query is like, oh, I'm syncing data. We're just going to breathe a little bit more life into that engine without trying to control everything about the experience, about the back end, and about the language that you use to do things. And if we can create that adapter economy there, I think that we could see some really cool stuff happen. We're working really closely with Electric SQL and also with Convex. Convex uses query directly, which is amazing. And we also have really good relationships with TRPC that uses query. So we have a lot of people involved in this space to different varying degrees. And I'm confident that that's really why we think now is a good time, is because we have enough signal to design something that could be helpful to a majority of people. We're trying to take it slow, though, to be honest, because this is not something you just rush into.
Oh, I completely agree. Maybe using this very topic as an opportunity to pull back the curtains a little bit. What I see as just like the common thread through all of the projects, all the TanStack projects, is that they have a very kind of like the TanStack way of like how the API looks and feels. It's like it's very intuitive. It's nicely modeled around the common scenarios, but then also allows for like reaching for that extra configuration, that extra functionality once you need it, but it doesn't overwhelm you up front with like needing to know of all of that. And now you're going into a new field and in an existing field even deeper. And so now you need to apply like that. At the end, there is a new TanStack DB product and library emerging. And I'm certain that it will feel just as intuitive and as nice as the other TanStack libraries. But that doesn't just happen by itself, but there's something, a lot of intuition, a lot of experience that's going into that. And I'm not sure whether you formalize that, but we got some questions from the audience, whether you have any sort of like process, guidelines, your own guidance, your inner guidance, intuition. How would you frame that? That could also serve as advice to others who aspire to build tools like the ones you're working on.
Well, I like to think about it. I like to approach it in a way of like, there's different tiers of things that you can control. So for me personally, if I'm working on a project, like building it myself, like I can control a lot, and I'm just very picky, and I try to be my best customer in a way. Like I try to approach using my own software as if I don't know everything about it. And call me schizophrenic, but like you need to be able to kind of assume this other identity to where you're like, okay, I don't know anything about this project. I'm trying to use this API. This is confusing. What does this even mean? So you need to wear multiple hats at the same time and be able to switch between them very quickly to say, oh yeah, okay, now I'm going to go back to architect Tanner and change this to make it easier to understand. So a lot of it is just, I think, just being very picky and just using your own tools like a lot, using your own tools a lot and showing other people your tools before you release them and say, well, what do you think about this? And trying to teach your tool to people, and they'll say, hey, that's really cool, but this is super weird. Like, I don't agree with that. So you just need to be getting feedback all the time and say, always be shipping, right? You can ship to a friend, you can ship to your company, you can ship somewhere. It doesn't have to be NPM before, you can get feedback. So that's kind of rule number one. After that, I believe that at this point for TanStack, things are also changing a little bit. Like I said, I'm not the one who's the driving force between TanStack DB. Kyle is. And if you look at other libraries, the same thing has kind of been happening. So TanStack Form was, the bulk of the entire project was spearheaded and completed and done by Corbin Crutchley. And it doesn't mean I had a lot to do with the initial like parts of TanStack Form, for the first little while, but I can't be everywhere all at once. So I've mostly been focusing on router and Start for the last 2 years. And so the next part of it is, if you can't control everything on your own, you need to be able to find people that you trust. And that's really what it comes down to is I get petitions and people every day on Twitter and on GitHub who are like, hey, I have this idea for a library, we should do it. Or I have this idea for a feature or whatever. And that's excellent feedback. And we take that feedback into consideration for everything that we see. But the choice of letting somebody come in and start making decisions for you is a really, really big decision. And it just needs to be one that you trust. And so if you see every single one of the core maintainers and core contributors to TanStack did not happen overnight, except for Corbin Crutchley. I met Corbin and I knew it in 10 minutes that he was the right person for the job. But it really comes down to trust. And at the end of the day, I trust, Dominic and Kevin and Corbin and Manuel and Sean and Chris and Kyle, right? I trust all these individuals and many more that I didn't mention because they understand the brand now. They understand our priorities and they understand what needs to happen. We prioritize type safety above all else. We prioritize the 90% use case above all else, but we make it so that you can gracefully opt into advanced features. It's not formalized in a document, but it is formalized in the experience that you get using one of these libraries. And if you know, you know. And if we're going to ship a new product, everybody collectively understands that it needs to meet the same standards as all the other products. So, and the people that I invite in or want to come and help me build stuff, those are people that I trust to execute on that vision. So
that is awesome. I fully agree with that. Thank you so much for sharing that. You've mentioned TanStack Router and TanStack Start. Both of those projects I'm also using myself a lot. I'm curious if you now extrapolate a little bit further, TanStack Start is just getting to a point where it will hit, I guess, 1.0 at some point as well. And if you now extrapolate forward, TanStack Start, filling in all of those features and boxes that you have in mind, and if you then take TanStack DB and you combine them, there's possibly like some really interesting opportunities that weren't really thinkable or possible before. Are there any kind of napkin sketches, shower thoughts you can share where you imagine like some new emerging superpowers or kind of like a new kind of framework that will be possible through this combination?
Not in the sense of like some new monolithic enclosure around these things, but like the vision that I have for it is that already today you can build a TanStack Start project. And when you build a Start project, you're not just using Start. People don't understand this either. So, I'll take the moment to explain it so that like when you use Next.js, right, you install Next.js and the router is enclosed inside of Next.js and the server loading strategies are all enclosed inside of there. The SSR tools and everything is just monolithic. It's abstractions around a whole thing, right? And they're dependencies inside of each other. Now, TanStack Start is very different. And it's weird because we say the framework is TanStack Start, but it's not. It's just a convenient marketing term to make it sound different than what TanStack Router is. So TanStack Router is what you'll still import with a Start application. You've used it, you know this. So when you import, most of the imports that you're making and the utilities that you're calling with TanStack Start are actually coming from Router. There's actually very few that are coming from Start until you need those server-side capabilities, right? So when you have your server entry, or you want to write an API route, or you have a server function, or you need some middleware, or you need to access request headers or something like that, that's when you reach for Start. And so it's interesting to think about Start and Router as they're parallel dependencies together. And yes, Start does rely on like a peer dependency in a sense of TanStack Router. So that's why we kind of say, oh, you're using TanStack Start because it implies usage of Router. But where they're together, I think that's the most interesting part because you get into the app and you start building and you realize that you're really just using these tools together. And maybe you're using TanStack Router and you're like, oh, this caching is really good in the router and I like this. And then you get to a moment where you're like, oh, I really wish I had formalized mutations around this thing or that I could share data between routes. So then you bring in TanStack Query and you don't just turn it on in the router, you bring in TanStack Query and they work together. So they have interfaces that integrate with each other and they work alongside each other. And my hope for something like TanStack DB around the router and Start is that it would be the same experience. You would bring it in and you would use it alongside these other utilities. But the solution should be that bringing in something like TanStack DB, the end result should be that you should be able to with a little bit more work, like you said, up at this top layer of producing, providing some schema and providing some structure, that you would be able to then get rid of a lot of the code that you have in your data loading lifecycle points and your user interaction points in your actual business logic of your application. The hope for something like TanStack DB would be similar to the experience of, somebody moving into TanStack Query, being able to get rid of all of that manual data fetching code with fetch and use effect and all this other stuff, moving to something like Query. I want that same experience for TanStack DB if it's warranted, right? So it's like you're unintentionally building schema and database and it's like you're trying to formalize all these contracts, but you don't have the right tool to do it. And so moving to TanStack DB should be an event that removes the burden of a lot of code that you've written and removes a lot of the burden of linking queries together and linking mutations and queries together. That should be the goal. Not only goal for the developer side of it, but also the user side of it, where when you move to query from something that's very manual, all of a sudden your data is up to date now. It's fresher. You can tell a website that's probably using React Query because you do something and it updates and it's always there. You focus the window and it's always there. Same thing for moving something like TanStack DB. You'll see better results around mutations. You'll click something, it won't just be optimistic, but it'll be synced everywhere. And when things happen on the server, and hopefully if you're using something like WebSockets or some kind of server sent event, you'll just kind of get that synced to you automatically without needing to invalidate or refocus the window or anything. So if we can move both of those chess pieces forward, both on the developer experience side of, hey, I get to delete code now and have better contracts and a better experience as a developer and just more confidence in what I'm doing. And as a user, you get to move forward to say things are faster, they're more responsive. And the user also has more confidence that what they're doing is happening and what they're seeing is up to date and real, right? So I think that's the end goal. And if we can't accomplish that, we won't launch it. That's the requirement.
That definitely resonates. And I think that's sort of like a nice litmus test for a library, that if you adopt a library in your application and the library does some things that you've previously done before, ideally the library should absorb everything that is not intent, that is very specific about your application. So everything that remains is like pure intent that's about my application. Everything else is like you've hopefully picked the right tool, that like the choice of the tool is part of your intent, but then you're zooming down like one level, become even more meta about within the scope of this tool, this library. Now I'm specifying my further intent. When you pick a really, really great tool, you can notice it by it removing even more code that you had previously written. It surprises you like how concise you can express what you want to do in a way that you didn't even expect how simple this can be. And I think a really great library kind of like surprises you through its simplicity. And so I want to round out this conversation on one last topic that I think you're a really excellent person to share your thoughts on this. Most TanStack projects are more client-side centric, like TanStack Table, TanStack Form, TanStack Query, etc. Those are all primitives that help us to build rich client-side applications. But if you're looking at the React ecosystem on a larger scale, there's been a lot of momentum and movement and developments more on the server-side spectrum of application development. And I think it can be a bit confusing for developers who are not as experienced on either side of the spectrum to what to kind of lean into, since not everything is always compatible. And there's maybe some applications that are being built that go heavily on server-side technologies, even though that's not the best fit for them, and vice versa. So I'm curious whether you can share some reflections on that sort of broadening spectrum of React covering the server as well, and whether you can provide some guidance to developers where to focus their attention on.
That's a hard question because there's a couple of different ways to look at that. There's a personal way to look at it, like what should you be learning yourself to, be relevant? And I think that you should know as much of the web platform as you can, right? Whether that's client or server, you should, if you're a web developer, you need to know the web, and that includes servers. So on a personal level, you need to be learning as much as you possibly can. Does that mean you need to be learning every language you can? No, but it means you need to know the concepts to be able to at least communicate with people or with a team, accurately. So there's like this personal level thing that I think is really important. Like, I am definitely not an expert at, other languages and like building server side things, servers. But I've worked with teams that have built very, very sophisticated systems, and I've helped architect some of those systems. And, I've been able to work through those thought processes and learn with them. So I think that's very valuable. Now, in practice, I think practice is a little bit different. And this is where it's like it depends. Because you might be at, some Y Combinator startup where you just have to know everything. And you are building full stack because you don't have a choice, right? And in that moment, your job requires you to do it all. So you better do it all. You better learn it. You better invest into everything that you need to ship your product. And I think that's really what it comes down to in practice is that, yes, you have to be thinking about your career, right? But not being negligent to the task at hand. And if you work for a company where you're expected to be a full stack developer, then you better make sure that you're investing in both the front end and the back end equally. If you work for a company and you're a front end developer and you know that, pretty soon they're going to start running React server components and server technology, does it mean you need to become a database expert and learn SQL and learn how to run Redis, and Kubernetes or just Docker or whatever? No, it doesn't necessarily mean all of that, but it does mean that within the realm of like JavaScript running on the server, you should probably start getting familiar with JavaScript on the server. You should probably start learning, what those patterns look like. And I think, on the really far end of the spectrum, which is more common than you think, because there's companies out there that have been around for a really long time. And they're running technology that's old and outdated, and they move slow, and they make a lot of money, and they have a lot of teams and a lot of employees, and maybe they're publicly traded, but that doesn't mean that, that they're even allowed to run JavaScript on the server. I mean, there are companies out there that are, billion-dollar companies that are not allowed to run JavaScript on the server yet. So in situations like that, it's like, well, do you need to focus on learning React server components? Sure, you go check it out and learn how to do some things with SSR and play around with it. But if that's your job is probably to be the best front end engineer that you possibly can. And if that's the case, you just need to make sure that you're focusing on what's important to your company. So I don't want to sound like, you need to sell out your career to your company. Obviously, I like to stay on the bleeding edge of everything as well. I'm just a really pragmatic person. And at the end of the day, everybody wants to get paid. Everybody needs to get paid. And we should not ignore that is a reality. And if your paycheck is important to you, it's a critical piece of your life, then you need to be focusing on what's going to make sure that paycheck keeps growing and getting bigger. And if that paycheck isn't going to get bigger or grow with your effort, then you should be learning other technologies that will help you secure either a different job or a promotion or whatever that's going to let you use that new knowledge to grow yourself and grow your career. That's kind of where I put it. So it's a lot of it depends, right?
Totally. I think that's fantastic advice. We can leave it at that. I know that you only have so much time. I just want to highlight one point. You've used the word pragmatic, and this is really what for me resembles, that's the essence of like the entire TanStack family of tools. Like it's above everything else, I think it's pragmatic. So in case you ever want to formalize that, that is like my candidate I'm offering to you. I want to thank you so much for taking the time, sharing everything that you've shared today, and for all the love, sweat, and tears you're putting into all of your projects for such a long time. I'm really excited to see where all of this is going, particularly excited for TanStack DB. And thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Local First FM podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode and haven't done so already, please subscribe and leave a review. Please also share this episode with your friends and colleagues. Spreading the word about the podcast is a great way to support it and to help me keep it going. A special thanks again to Jazz for supporting this podcast. I'll see you next time.